What if I told you that some of the most common, cheapest drugs out there, medicines designed to fight parasitic worms, might hold a secret key to fighting cancer? It's a huge claim, one that has absolutely exploded online, and it's all fueled by some incredibly powerful personal stories.
It really all kicked off with claims just like this one, shared all over social media. You have a patient with a terminal diagnosis who says he was cured by taking a dewormer meant for dogs. That story went viral, and it just sparked this firestorm of hope, of intense debate, and the serious rush on these kinds of drugs.
And look, you can totally see why these stories are so powerful, right? For patients and families searching for any glimmer of hope, they're compelling. But we have to step back from the anecdotes and the online chatter and ask that one crucial question. What does the actual science have to say about this?
Okay, let's really dive into this. To get a handle on the whole controversy, we first need to understand what these drugs are and what they were actually made to do in the first place.
So, the drugs at the heart of all of this belong to a class called anthelmintics. These are well-established, widely used medications with one main job: getting rid of parasitic worms in both people and animals. And for that purpose, they are considered really safe and effective.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because the leap we're talking about here is just massive. On one hand, you have their day job, right? The thing they're approved for, killing relatively simple parasitic worms. But on the other hand, we're asking if they can take on some of the most complex, most adaptable cells in the human body. It's a huge jump from a worm to a cancer cell, and that's the whole question here.
So how did this even happen? I mean, how does a drug for parasites even get on the radar of cancer researchers? Well, the story doesn't start with some grand theory. It actually starts with a completely unexpected, almost accidental observation in a laboratory. This timeline shows how a single accident can really spark years of research. It all goes back to 2009 at Johns Hopkins. Researchers there were studying brain tumors in mice, and they noticed something really weird. One group of tumors just wasn't growing. The only difference? Those mice had been given a common dewormer, mebendazole. That totally accidental find is what kicked this whole thing off. And in the lab, the results were pretty intriguing. Scientists figured out that these drugs seem to attack the cancer cell's internal scaffolding, its skeleton, which is made of something called microtubules. Think of it like trying to take apart the frame of a house while it's trying to build a copy of itself. By messing with that skeleton, the drugs stop cancer cells from dividing. They also seem to cut off their sugar supply, their energy source. And they saw these effects in petri dishes on a bunch of different cancers, like brain, lung, and colon cancer. But here's where we hit the reality check. A promising result in a petri dish or a mouse, that's just the very first tiny step on a super long and difficult road. What works in a controlled lab setting so often doesn't work in the incredible complexity of the human body. So, how do you cross that massive gap from the lab to the clinic? Well, you have to go through this really grueling process: human clinical trials. As you can see, it all starts with phase 1, which is all about safety, just figuring out a safe dose. Then you move to phase 2 for an early peek at whether it might actually work in a small group. And finally, if you get that far, there's phase 3. That's the ultimate test, a big randomized trial to prove it's actually better than what we already have. And here is the most crucial point. The vast majority of drugs that look amazing in the lab will fail at some point during this human testing process. That leap from a preclinical finding to a proven therapy for people is where most potential treatments just fall short. So knowing all that, what happens when we go looking for that high-quality human trial data for these specific drugs? What does the evidence actually show in real cancer patients? The most significant human study we have so far is a phase 1 clinical trial from Johns Hopkins. Yep, the same place where that accidental discovery happened. They tested a drug called mebendazole, which is a close cousin to fendazole, in patients with a really aggressive type of brain cancer called high-grade glioma. But you have to remember, the main goal of a phase 1 trial is not to see if the drug works. It's to find out if it's safe at high doses. So, what did they find? Well, they reported a median overall survival of 21 months. And while that number is definitely interesting, it's not the main takeaway. Again, this was a phase 1 trial. The number one conclusion was that the drug was safe enough to keep studying, even though they had to watch for liver issues. This number doesn't prove the drug is effective, it just proves it was safe enough to move forward with more tests. In fact, the researchers who actually ran the trial were crystal clear with their conclusion. They explicitly warned people against using the drug off-label for cancer, stating very plainly that its effectiveness has simply not been proven in a rigorous trial. That's a direct caution from the scientists who are closest to the data.
Okay, so what about ivermectin? That's another drug that gets a ton of attention. Well, the situation here is even more clear-cut. While there are some similar lab studies suggesting it might have potential, the human evidence is basically non-existent. Oncologists, major medical organizations, they all agree there are just no controlled clinical trials to support using ivermectin for cancer. The claims you see are based on personal stories, not the kind of hard scientific data you need. And all of this leads us to this fundamental problem, this massive gap between the hope that's being fueled by viral stories and the hard reality of the scientific proof that's actually available.
This chart just says it all, doesn't it? On one side, you have this absolute mountain of online claims, videos, and personal testimonials. But the foundation that whole mountain is built on, the actual solid human clinical trial data, is incredibly small. And so far, it's inconclusive about whether these drugs really work.
And this isn't just about a lack of proof. There are some pretty significant risks. Side effects can be anything from nausea to seizures. Taking high doses can damage your liver, but maybe the biggest danger is drug interactions. If you take an unproven therapy at the same time as chemotherapy, it could actually make the proven treatment less effective. And it's so important to remember, mebendazole is a dog dewormer. We have no idea if it's safe for humans to take long term. Medical organizations all over the world have been really clear and consistent on this. The Spanish Society of Medical Oncology, for instance, says flat out there is no solid scientific evidence that supports its efficacy. This isn't just one doctor's opinion. It's the consensus of the global medical community, and it's based on the current lack of evidence. So, here's the bottom line. That initial scientific spark, that accident in the lab is real. It's intriguing. These drugs absolutely show some anti-cancer properties in lab models, but they are a very, very long way from being a proven cancer therapy for people. The evidence just isn't there yet. And that leaves us with this final difficult question. When you're facing a devastating diagnosis, the desperation of patients and their families is completely understandable. When science moves slowly and hope is in short supply, it creates this powerful pull towards anything that seems to offer a chance. The real challenge for all of us is how to navigate that space between cautious, evidence-based medicine and the powerful, very human need to believe.